What's up, guys? My Latin Life here, your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. Today, I wanted to talk about tax residency versus legal residency in Mexico. Understanding the distinction between tax residency and legal residency in Mexico is crucial, especially for expats, digital nomads, and anyone considering living or working in the country. While these two concepts are related, they serve different purposes and are governed by separate rules. And this might be a new concept to you, the idea that someone could be a legal resident in Mexico but not a tax resident in Mexico, because the country you're coming from, maybe it's the United States, maybe it's Canada, these countries, it works different in Canada, the US, let's put it that way. And in Mexico, tax and legal residency are different concepts. Okay, so legal residency refers to your immigration status in Mexico. It determines your right to live, work, and stay in the country for an extended period of time. Okay, so there's different types of legal residency. There's temporary residency, which is usually granted for up to 4 years and can be renewed. Temporary residents have the right to live in Mexico but must renew their status periodically. And then permanent residency in Mexico allows you to live in Mexico indefinitely. It's often granted after 4 years of temporary residency, but can also be granted immediately under certain conditions, such as having Mexican family ties or a specific income level. Okay? The application process to obtain legal residency, you typically apply at a Mexican consulate in your home country. There are certain circumstances where you can apply for legal residency from within Mexico, but in most cases it's going to be from your home country. The process involves proving your income, providing documentation such as passports and birth certificates, and sometimes attending an interview. Legal residents can then open bank accounts in Mexico, buy property in Mexico, work in Mexico with some restrictions for temporary residents. They're also required to register with Migraciones and keep their residency status current. All in all, legal residency does not equal tax residency. Holding legal residency in Mexico does not automatically make you a tax resident. This is really, really crucial, guys, because a lot of people say, okay, if I get Mexico residency, am I on the hook for taxes? No, it's not an automatic thing. You can be a legal resident without being a tax resident in Mexico, especially if you do not meet the criteria for tax residency, such as you spend less than 183 days per year in Mexico. Okay? So you can get legal residency in Mexico, and it does not make you a tax resident of Mexico, okay? So if you're coming from the US, getting residency in Mexico isn't going to mess with your situation in the US. If you're a legal resident of Mexico, you don't even have to file tax returns in Mexico unless you break the threshold of becoming a tax resident, and we'll get to that in a second. But just again, I got to reiterate this like 10 times. If you get Mexico residency, you do not have to file tax returns. You're not automatically a tax resident. And so because of that, Mexico residency, there's kind of no downside because there's no tax implications, and there's also very low physical presence requirements. So I think Mexico residency is an absolute no-brainer. And by the way, MyLatinLife, we're an immigration agency. We can help you get residency in Mexico. Whether you're Australian, European, Canadian, American, whatever, we can help you get residency in Mexico as well as every other country in Latin America. So moving on to tax residency in Mexico. Tax residency determines your obligation to pay taxes to the Mexican government. It's based on different criteria than legal residency and can apply actually even if you don't even have legal residency. You could technically be a tax resident even if you're not even, a legal resident of Mexico. So what are the criteria for tax residency in Mexico? What would make you a tax resident of Mexico? One is physical presence. spending more than 183 days a year in Mexico in a calendar year generally makes you a tax resident, but there's definitely exceptions there. And this would apply regardless of your legal residency status. So let's just say you were on tourist visas and either you overstayed your visa or you did a border run and you left and came back and ultimately spent more than 183 days a year in Mexico. That can be a criteria that can lead to you being a tax resident in Mexico. Another criteria is having a permanent home in Mexico. If Mexico is your main place of residence where you and your family live, you are likely considered a tax resident. Okay? There's definitely a lot of nuances in terms of the permanent home thing. It's like, are you renting in Mexico? Do you own property in other countries? And there's all these kind of tiebreaker rules. But just know that, if it's your permanent home, that's another criteria that could lead you to being considered a tax resident. Okay? Another one is your center of vital interests. If the primary source of your income or economic activities is in Mexico, you may be classified as a tax resident even if you spend less than 183 days a year in the country. So that means if you own a Mexican business and it's your primary source of income, or if you work for a Mexican company as an employee, these sorts of economic activities, obviously these would point to Mexico being your center of vital interest because that's where you make your money. Of course, it gets more complicated if, say, you have a Mexican business, but you also have other businesses around the world. And for more complicated situations, definitely reach out to us, reach out to MyLatinLife, and we can get you straightened out. We can start working with Mexican lawyers and tax accountants and stuff like that if you have a little bit more hairy of a situation. So those are some of the criteria. What about obligations? As a tax resident of Mexico, you're required to pay tax on your worldwide income, not just the income earned in Mexico. You must also file an annual tax return with SAT, the SAT, which is like the tax authority in Mexico, and report any foreign assets, okay? So if you were to become a tax resident of Mexico and Mexico deemed you as such, you'd be required to pay taxes on your worldwide income, not just Mexican income. Mexico's not a territorial tax country as such. Obviously, they're more chill about a lot of things. But Mexicans who, grow up in Mexico and live their whole life in Mexico, they're paying tax on their worldwide income, okay? And I know that's a scary situation for foreigners, and it's one that's avoidable, of course, with proper planning. Another thing is just reiterating that you don't have to be a legal resident to be a tax resident. You can be considered a tax resident without holding legal residency, okay? So for example, if you spent a significant amount of time in Mexico or earn most of your income there, you could be liable for Mexican taxes even if you're not a legal resident, okay? So there's kind of like a Venn diagram here. You can be a legal resident and not a tax resident. You can be a tax resident and not a legal resident. Or, of course, there are situations where you can be both a legal and tax resident. I'm assuming for most people, you probably want to be a legal resident because you want to, have residencies around the world. You want to have a plan B. You want to have Mexico as maybe a playground country or something in your back pocket, but you don't want to be dragged into the Mexican tax net. And book a call with MyLatinLife if you have further questions about that, how to kind of structure your affairs based on your specific situation. So let's kind of review some key differences, okay? So legal residency relates to your right to live and work in Mexico. And legal residents get a resident card, right? It's going to be green, or it's going to be like this orangish color, and it's going to be a resident card with your face on it. And that's legal residency, right? And then tax residency relates to your obligation to pay taxes in Mexico. And there's no tax resident card, right? Like there's no separate card for that. It's more of like a determination of status. And regarding the criteria again, legal residency is based on your immigration status. determined by the INM, that's the Migraciones or the Migrations Office of Mexico. And then tax residency is based on the criteria we talked about: physical presence, economic ties, the location of your permanent home, and it's something that's determined by SAT, the SAT, okay? So legal residency is with INM, tax residency is with SAT. So again, it's possible to be a legal resident without being a tax resident and vice versa. These two statuses do not automatically coincide. In conclusion, legal residency and tax residency are two separate concepts in Mexico with distinct criteria and implications. While legal residency concerns your immigration status and rights in Mexico, tax residency concerns your tax obligations. Understanding the difference between these two types of residency is essential for managing your legal and financial responsibilities while living or spending time in Mexico. I know this might be sort of a new concept because there are countries where legal and tax residency are one and the same. In Mexico, they are distinct, and hopefully this video shed some more light on the circumstances. So if you want to become a resident of Mexico, if you want to get Mexican residency for yourself and your family, hit us up at MyLatinLife. You can book a call with us. There'll be a link in the description to book a call. Or you can go to MyLatinLife.com. There's a services page, and you can order the Mexico residency assistance right off the website. We have tons of videos about different aspects of Mexico residency, about the financial requirements, about temporary versus permanent and the pros and cons of those. So check out some of the other videos on our channel to learn more. And when you're ready to pull the trigger, we're here to work with you. So if you enjoyed this video, if you got value out of this video, please comment, please like, subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next video.